January 1943. Eastern Front. A nameless white plain stretching endlessly under a sun the color of brass. The snow is frozen into ridges sharp as broken glass. Every breath hangs in the air like smoke. In a shallow ditch just outside a ruined village, a lone gunner kneels beside his anti-tank gun, the barrel rimed with frost, the metal groaning in the cold. His gloves are torn, his eyes fixed on a small, scratched object in his palm. It isn't a weapon. It's a child's toy compass. Around him, the others watch silently. They had laughed at him earlier, laughed at the idea that a toy could help find and kill a Panzer. But now, with engine sounds rolling closer through the snow, no one's laughing. The gunner presses the compass against a battered map case, aligning its trembling needle with a distant tree line. Then he whispers the bearing to his loader. A minute later, two black silhouettes emerge from the white horizon, German Panzers advancing, their steel tracks clattering like thunder across ice. And that small, stupid idea is about to change everything. By January 1943, the Eastern Front had become a vast white wound across the continent. From Leningrad in the north to the Caucasus in the south, more than 2,000 kilometers of front blurred into the same horizon of smoke and snow. Hitler's armies, stretched and freezing, were fighting to hold ground they had once conquered in a summer blaze. Soviet forces, hardened by loss and winter, were learning, fast, how to fight, move, and kill in sub-zero war. The German tank, once a symbol of unstoppable momentum, was no longer a myth. The Panzers that had torn across Europe in 1940 now fought against an enemy that studied every weak point, the tracks, the side armor, the exposed rear of an engine deck. The Red Army, bled white but unbroken, was building a new doctrine of resistance. In the early months of 1943, the fighting around Voronezh and the approaches to the Don Basin showed the change. German spearheads were still powerful, formations of Panzer III and Panzer IV, supported by assault guns and motorized infantry, pushing across the snow with disciplined precision. But behind every ridge and in every ruined hamlet, Soviet anti-tank crews waited, often alone, often with obsolete guns, and almost always outnumbered. The 3.7 cm Pak-36, the same weapon that had served Germany in the early Blitzkrieg, had already earned a grim nickname from its own troops, Heeresangriffgerät, the army doorknocker. Against the thickened armor of the Panzer IV OSV, G or the new Tiger, its shells bounced like pebbles. On the Soviet side, the problem was the same in reverse. The 45 mm 1937 gun, light and mobile, could still kill a Panzer III at short range, but only if the crew survived long enough to get within 300 meters. That meant ambush. It meant guessing where the enemy would appear and striking first. The Red Army's anti-tank doctrine in 1942-43 relied heavily on hunters' detachments, 2 or 3 gun teams dispersed across likely tank avenues, connected by rudimentary field telephones or prearranged compass bearings. Many had no radios. Maps were crude, sometimes outdated by years. A single compass reading could determine whether a gun barrel faced salvation or annihilation. And that is where ingenuity began to replace equipment. Within these desperate detachments, men learned to improvise. They used the shadows of trees to mark range lines, frozen corpses as aiming stakes, the barrel of a captured rifle as a sighting rod. Some carried homemade periscopes made from mirror shards. Others used children's toys, anything with a magnetized needle, to orient themselves when official compasses were lost or frozen solid. To understand how absurd yet vital this seemed, one must remember what the Eastern Front did to technology. Metal froze to skin, oil thickened to tar, optics fogged and shattered. The compass, that simple, ancient device, could decide the direction of life and death. At this point of the war, the German 4th Panzer Army, retreating after the failure at Stalingrad, was attempting to stabilize its line west of the Don. Soviet pursuit was relentless but chaotic. Units outran their supply lines, and artillery positions were improvised daily. Somewhere within these makeshift defenses, on the edge of a nameless village buried under snowdrifts, a Soviet gun crew was ordered to cover a frozen approach road. the same road along which 2 German tanks would soon advance. The gunner leading that team was not an officer. He was a senior corporal, trained in the summer heat of 1941, twice wounded, and twice returned to duty. His weapon was an M1937-45 gun with a cracked sight housing and a recoil spring that leaked oil. His compass, officially, was listed as lost in action, August 1942. The replacement he found had come from a dead child's toy chest in a ruined farmhouse. It was the kind of compass once glued to the dashboard of a wooden toy truck, its casing brass, its face painted with a fatting red star for north. The magnetic needle still worked. At first, the others laughed. A toy compass to fight tanks. But the corporal wasn't trying to be clever. He had seen too many guns wasted because they faced the wrong angle when the enemy appeared. His idea was simple. Mark out a compass-based grid from the gun's position, assign each bearing a pre-measured range line across the snow, and note landmarks along those lines, trees, haystacks, chimneys. Then, when scouts reported Panzers on bearing 220, his gun could traverse instantly to that azimuth without sighting anew. It was crude fire control, a field-expedient version of what trained artillery officers did with protractors and maps. But for a small gun crew without instruments, it turned the white chaos of the steppe into an ordered field of fire. The method spread quietly among neighboring crews. It took no orders, no paperwork, just a few minutes of marking lines with bayonets in the snow. And because it seemed too simple to matter, command ignored it. Meanwhile, across the same frozen landscape, German armored columns moved according to their own rigid precision. Each platoon of panzers advanced by clockwork orders: march route, interval, phase line, halt. Their maps were printed weeks earlier, showing villages that no longer existed and roads buried under snow. A Soviet gun that could reorient in seconds might strike where the Germans thought the ground was clear. By mid-January, the tempo of retreat and pursuit had created chaos across the front. Field Marshal Manstein, newly appointed to rescue Army Group South, was orchestrating a counterstroke from Kharkov, while General Golikov's Voronezh front pressed hard to encircle the German formations left behind. In this swirl of movement, isolated gun crews fought small wars of their own, ambushes lasting minutes, forgotten hours later. Our corporal's position, dug into a frozen ditch near a crossroads east of Ostrogozhsk, was one of hundreds. His gun faced south across open snow. Behind him, the remnants of an infantry company huddled in shell holes, waiting for tanks they could not stop. For 3 days, they saw nothing but smoke on the horizon. Then, just before noon on January 17, the lookout heard engines, slow, deliberate, heavy. 2 vehicles. The corporal took out the toy compass. He had already plotted his bearings the night before. 180 degrees aligned with the road, 220 and 240 marking the depressions where German tanks might bypass the destroyed bridge. He checked the needle's trembling alignment, whispered the range to his loader, and waited. The rest of his story, the shot, the hit, the disbelief, belongs to the moment of ambush itself. But before that can unfold, we need to understand what this small invention represented in the mechanics of war. Because in 1943, amid the industrial scale of tanks and artillery, it was sometimes a single handheld compass that decided who lived and who burned. To grasp the scale of what that lone gunner was facing, one must first see the enormous chessboard of the Eastern Front in early 1943. The German Sixth Army was dying in Stalingrad's ruins. Entire corps were collapsing under Soviet encirclement, but hundreds of kilometers to the west, other German armies, still armed, still dangerous, were retreating in comparatively good order. These were veteran formations: 4th Panzer Army, 2nd Army, and remnants of the Hungarian 2nd Army, clinging to the river lines and open steppe roads of southern Russia. For the Soviets, this was a moment of triumph tempered by exhaustion. Victory at Stalingrad had broken the myth of Nazi invincibility, but it had not ended the war. Every kilometer westward was paid for in fuel, frostbite, and blood. The Red Army's spearheads were moving faster than their supply trucks. Ammunition arrived by sled. Diesel froze in drums. Soldiers fought with what they had, and often with less. Tanks ran dry halfway through offensives. Artillery batteries used captured shells from enemy dumps. It was a war that punished logistics even more than tactics. Under these conditions, the Red Army relied heavily on its smallest units, gun crews, scouts, and rifle platoons, to think for themselves. Orders issued from Corps headquarters could take hours to reach the front. By then, the situation had changed. In this chaos, soldiers learned a truth that was as old as war itself. Initiative mattered more than orders. The German side was no less strained. The Wehrmacht's doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, was collapsing under the weight of geography and temperature. Panzers that once swept forward now stalled in deep snow, their engines laboring against cold and mud. The winter of 1942-43 was among the coldest of the war, with temperatures plunging to 30 degrees C in places. Steel contracted and cracked, lubricants thickened, crews froze to their seats. Yet discipline held. Panzer battalions still formed up at dawn, maps on knees, compasses in hand. They trusted instruments, training, and timing. That was both their strength and their flaw. German tank commanders, bound by strict operational patterns, tended to move along known approach routes. Roads, rail lines, and frozen riverbeds became the arteries of every advance. But those same routes were predictable, visible even from a low ridge. For an alert anti-tank crew, especially one using bearings and landmarks to pre-plot their aim, a panzer's precision could become its vulnerability. And so, amid the massive tide of history, the battlefield shrank to the scale of one man with a compass. Improvisation was not unique to the Soviets. Across all fronts, small innovations were blooming in the cracks of official doctrine. In North Africa, British gunners used sun compasses to orient anti-tank batteries in the desert's featureless expanse. In Tunisia, American crews built makeshift range tables taped to their gun trails. In Italy, partisans used stolen field compasses to time demolitions by angle of sunrise. But nowhere did these personal solutions matter more than on the Eastern Front. There, visibility stretched for miles, and survival often depended on seconds. The vast steppe, with its absence of landmarks, disoriented even experienced officers. Compasses froze or lost magnetism under shell fire. A working needle, no matter its origin, could mean the difference between firing at shadows or firing true. It was a world where trivial objects, bits of wire, cigarette tins, toys, were repurposed as tools of war. And it was also a world where ridicule was a common defense against fear. Soldiers mocked what they didn't understand. Stupid ideas were often masks for desperation. Within this culture of improvisation, the corporal's compass plan fit a pattern quietly shaping the Red Army's evolution. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, had begun to embrace what it called samostoytnost, independent initiative. Field reports from the front were filled with examples. Tank crews welding logs to armor skirts, infantry using German smoke shells as makeshift grenades, or artillerymen constructing wooden aiming frames to replace broken sights. Commanders noticed that these improvisations, however crude, worked. Each success, no matter how local, was studied, copied, and sometimes absorbed into doctrine. By early 1943, manuals for artillery and anti-tank units began to include advice that would have sounded absurd 2 years earlier. If official instruments are lost, improvised orientation by natural or artificial compass is permitted. The line might have been written for men like that gunner near Ostrogozhsk. Meanwhile, on the German side, new threats loomed. The Wehrmacht's armored advantage was eroding fast. The T-34, once rare, now dominated Soviet tank formations. Its 76.2 gun could punch through Panzer III and IV armor at nearly 1,000 meters. For the first time, German crews were fighting an enemy tank superior in both firepower and mobility. In response, the Germans relied on experience and communication. Each tank platoon carried at least 2 compasses, one for navigation, one for artillery reference. They advanced in disciplined echelons, with flank guards and overwatch positions. It was a doctrine that assumed control of the situation, but in a retreat, control dissolves. By January 1943, the Germans were no longer attacking in massed waves. They were probing, withdrawing, covering gaps. Their maps showed Soviet positions that no longer existed, their radio nets filled with broken transmissions. Under such conditions, even a small, hidden gun, properly aligned, could strike a blow far greater than its size. This convergence, German precision meeting Soviet improvisation, defined the Eastern Front in miniature. One side trusted calculation, the other survived through adaptation. On January 17th, that difference would collide. The two panzers approaching the crossroads east of Ostrogozhsk were part of a rear-guard detachment from the 11th Panzer Division. Their mission was simple: scout the road for Soviet pursuit and clear any light resistance before withdrawing to the next defensive line. They moved slowly, aware of the risk of mines and ambushes, but confident that no organized Soviet armor could be this far forward. They were right, there were no tanks. Only snow, silence, and a gun crew half buried in frost. For the corporal crouched beside his weapon, the moment before battle was neither heroic nor fearful. It was mechanical. He checked the traverse. He checked the elevation. He looked again at the tiny compass, the red star pointing north, its face scratched and cloudy. In that compass lay more than direction. It held intention, a human attempt to impose order on chaos. As the panzers approached, the bearing he had plotted, 220 degrees, was exactly the path they chose. His loader waited for the signal. The compass needle trembled. The engines grew louder. The ambush was seconds away. One, the human angle, a soldier of improvisation. He was one among millions. No medals, no headlines, just another weary figure swallowed by the Eastern Front. Soviet records from early 1943 list thousands of small-unit actions, most anonymous, some lasting only minutes, few ever documented. Yet each depended on human instincts sharpened by survival. The corporal, his name lost in the frozen bureaucracy of war, was part of a generation forged by catastrophe. Born into poverty, trained under haste, he had learned that the enemy's steel wasn't his worst threat, indifference was. Orders arrived late, ammunition misfired, maps lied. Every day was a negotiation between discipline and improvisation. To him, the compass wasn't a symbol of defiance. It was practicality. When the official tools failed, he reached for anything that worked. In the Red Army, such pragmatism was both mocked and admired. Commanders demanded obedience, but survival demanded invention. Those who fought beside him remembered the same kind of men. Quiet, stubborn, and utterly unremarkable until a moment of crisis revealed something else. A clarity of thought that no rank or doctrine could teach. In the frost-bitten ditches outside Ostrogozhsk, this human clarity was rarer than ammunition. The corporal's stupid idea was, in truth, a small act of rebellion against helplessness. He couldn't change the war, but he could change the direction of his gun. It was enough. 2. The tactical angle, turning bearings into bullets. Anti-tank warfare, by 1943, had evolved from static defense into a brutal art of anticipation. Success didn't belong to the gun with the biggest shell. It belonged to the crew that could see seconds further into the future. An ambush depended on three things: location, timing, and orientation. The corporal's compass grid turned orientation from guesswork into geometry. Instead of swinging a 500-kilogram gun wildly toward sound or dust, his crew already knew where to aim. Bearings translated into arcs of fire intersected with likely tank routes. The method was primitive but mathematically sound. Soviet artillery manuals taught crews to reference azimuth marks on prepared positions. The corporal's compass trick recreated this principle on open ground. By aligning his gun with true north, then pre-plotting sectors in 10-degree increments, he could command his loader. 220, 300 meters, ready. The gun would rotate exactly toward that line, the sight would find the landmark, and the shell would fly. German tanks relied on movement and shock to close distance quickly. But when a crew fired first, and accurately, the entire logic of armored warfare reversed. The Panzer's power depended on momentum. Stopping it stripped that power away. The corporal's tactic gave his gun that split-second edge. The compass didn't make his weapon stronger, it made it faster. Even in the broader context of the war, such speed mattered immensely. In early 1943, Soviet anti-tank units were learning rapid redeployment firing, a precursor to modern shoot-and-scoot tactics. The compass method fit perfectly. Lightweight guns, small crews, fast bearings, short engagements. Kill, shift, disappear. On maps, these fights looked meaningless. 2 tanks lost here, a gun crew destroyed there. But multiplied by hundreds, they bled the armored spearheads dry. And so, while the grand strategies of Kharkov and Stalingrad filled headlines, the real erosion of German armor came from actions like this. Minute confrontations, where a man and a machine met at right angles, guided by nothing more than a needle in a brass casing. 3. The technological angle, the toy and the machine. The irony of that toy compass lay in the nature of both sides' technology. By 1943, the German Panzer force was approaching its mechanical peak. The Panzer IV OSV G, equipped with a long 75 kW K-40 gun, could destroy any Soviet tank at a kilometer's range. Its armor reached 80 millimeters thick on the front. It was the product of a vast industrial apparatus, every bolt and bearing standardized. Opposite it, the Soviet M193745 gun was already outdated, designed when tanks were lighter and slower. Its armor-piercing rounds could barely penetrate a Panzer's front, but still lethal from the flank or rear. Yet it was light, easy to move, and simple to repair. Between these extremes, mechanical precision versus functional simplicity, stood the compass. A compass, after all, is a machine too, a suspended magnet seeking order in chaos. It is pure physics, unbothered by mud or bureaucracy. That the corporal found one in a toy mattered little. What mattered was that it worked. In fact, the toy's small size offered an advantage. Military compasses of the era, like the Soviet H-46 or the German Bezard model, were bulky, calibrated, and easily damaged by shock. A child's compass, with fewer moving parts and no liquid damping, resisted freezing. Its magnet was weak but stable, its casing simple brass instead of brittle glass. In the field, the difference between a frozen lens and a turning needle could mean survival. This is what modern historians call field innovation under constraint. In later decades, military theorists would cite such improvisations as proof that adaptability often outperforms technology. In 1943, it was simply necessity. When the gunner pressed his palm against that small brass disc, he wasn't defying technology, he was refining it. And when his shot found its mark, the balance between invention and machinery tilted, if only for a heartbeat, in favor of the man. 4. Leadership and command, the blind spots of doctrine. War at its highest levels is written in plans, but at its lowest, it is lived in fragments. By 1943, both the German and Soviet commands were prisoners of their own doctrines. On paper, their systems could not have been more different. The Wehrmacht prized autonomy, Auftragstaktik, allowing junior officers to act on intent rather than instruction. The Red Army, by contrast, had been purged of initiative. Its early war disasters were rooted in fear of disobedience. But by 1943, reality had flipped. German commanders, bled and retreating, now followed rigid defensive protocols. Soviet leaders, scarred by chaos, began to tolerate, even encourage, improvisation at the front. What had once been punished as insubordination was increasingly described in reports as initiative under fire. Still, leadership struggled to understand innovation from below. A corporal using a child's compass didn't fit into any doctrinal manual. No decoration awaited such acts. For higher command, victory was measured in kilometers gained or tanks destroyed, not in the logic behind a single shot. And yet, these individual acts quietly shifted the war's rhythm. Every time a small gun outwitted a tank column, the illusion of German mechanical invincibility cracked a little further. Soviet officers began to notice. Field orders started including phrases like local adaptation authorized and independent fire planning encouraged. By spring 1943, this culture of autonomy would bloom fully at Kursk, where hidden anti-tank zones and flexible fields of fire shredded German armor on a scale unthinkable a year earlier. The seed of that doctrine was planted in actions just like this, where one man, stupid idea, proved smarter than the system around him. Leadership rarely records its lessons in real time. Often, it is the frozen ground that remembers first. 5. The enemy's view inside the Panzer. From the German perspective, tank warfare on the Eastern Front had become a paradox. The very weapon that once defined their dominance was turning into a liability. German tank crews were professionals, disciplined, methodical, bound by training that emphasized precision over intuition. They lived by range tables, sector maps, and synchronized advance. A compass and stopwatch guided every maneuver. Each tank's position was an equation. But equations fail in chaos. To a Panzer commander, the most terrifying moment wasn't being hit. It was not knowing from where. In open terrain, an unseen gun could fire from 2 kilometers away. In snow, sound carried strangely. In fog, light refracted. A flash of movement could be illusion or death. When 2 tanks of the 11th Panzer Division rolled toward that crossroads near Ostrogozhsk, they were performing a textbook action, recon by fire. Their drivers advanced in staggered formation, the commanders scanning with binoculars. The road ahead looked clear. There were no muzzle flashes, no footprints, no glint of glass. And then, in less than 10 seconds, both tanks were hit. To the crews, it must have felt like sorcery. They had followed procedure, advanced by the book, and still the unseen gun had found them. Post-action reports would later attribute such losses to well-sighted anti-tank fire. But the truth was smaller, simpler. A compass bearing pre-marked by a soldier the Germans would never meet. From the German side, encounters like this eroded confidence. The myth of Soviet rigidity, of an army too crude to aim precisely, began to fade. Tank commanders started to hesitate before cresting ridges or crossing frozen roads. That hesitation, multiplied across divisions, slowed momentum. Fear spreads faster than armor. 6. The moral and psychological angle, the weight of ridicule. War creates many forms of courage. Some are loud, the charge, the last stand. Others are quieter, the courage to be laughed at. Before the ambush, the corporal's comrades had mocked his compass method. It wasn't malice, it was exhaustion disguised as humor. Soldiers often joke about what frightens them most. In a world where death was routine, laughter became a defense against absurdity. But ridicule has weight. Every man who fought under its shadow carried an invisible burden, the fear of being foolish and the fear of being wrong. When the first Panzer erupted in smoke, that burden shifted. In the stunned silence that followed, laughter turned into awe. The compass, once a joke, became an amulet. It proved that survival could come from thought as much as firepower. This transformation, from mockery to respect, captures something profoundly human about wartime psychology. Innovation in battle rarely begins with approval. It begins with doubt. The difference between stupid and brilliant is measured in seconds, often the time between a shot fired and a shell striking steel. Psychologically, that shift mattered more than the destruction of 2 tanks. It reminded soldiers that intellect, not just courage, had a place in the trenches. And somewhere beneath that frozen sky, as the corporal reloaded and the loader stared at the tiny compass in disbelief, both men felt something change, not the war itself, but their sense of power within it. For the first time in months, they weren't merely surviving. They were outthinking the enemy. The frost never truly melted that January, even under fire. In the shallow ditch north of Ostrogozhsk, the gun crew waited, 4 men, a 45 Mem 42 anti-tank gun, and a silence so deep it hummed. The corporal checked the compass one last time. Its needle trembled, catching faintly in the cold. He had aligned it earlier using the sun and a known tree line, marking bearings for the road the Germans always used when counterattacking. It was simple geometry, 42 degrees east of north, 750 meters. The gun had already been angled accordingly, buried slightly in snow to disguise its silhouette. They could not see the road from their trench. They didn't need to. A distant vibration reached them first, low, rhythmic, metallic. Panzer engines. The loader gripped the first shell, its brass casing dull beneath a layer of frost. The breech was open. The corporal crouched behind the sight, breath steady, face expressionless. Minutes passed. Then, faintly, a line of movement appeared over the ridge, the top of a turret, moving slow and deliberate, scanning the horizon. He did not fire. He waited. Another followed, slightly offset, covering its partner's flank. Classic German advance technique, 2 Panzers leapfrogging, one firing while the other moved. They were confident, almost casual, believing the snowfield before them empty. Through the frozen air, every gear and tread echoed like hammer blows. At 600 meters, the corporal whispered the bearing again, 4-2. The loader nodded. The crosshairs of the sight, calibrated for 800 meters, held steady on a patch of white nothingness where the tank would appear in seconds. Then came the moment, a shadow darkening the snow as the lead Panzer crested the ridge. Its hull was perfectly aligned with the preset bearing. The corporal exhaled. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed through the gun like a living thing, shaking the ground. A white burst of smoke erupted from the muzzle, instantly swallowed by wind. Half a second later, impact. The shell struck just below the turret ring, the weakest point of a Panzer III's armor. A sharp metallic crack echoed, followed by a puff of black smoke from the vent grills. The tank halted mid-slope, its tracks grinding uselessly. The loader was already pushing the second round into the breach. No shouts, no celebration, just precision. The second Panzer lurched forward, its gun swinging toward the flash point. But the corporal had already shifted 2 degrees left, the adjustment pre-calculated. Another shot. Another impact. This one pierced the side plate of the second tank as it tried to pivot, igniting ammunition inside. The explosion rolled across the snow in a slow, rising bloom of flame and debris. For the German crews, it must have been incomprehensible, death from nowhere, no visible muzzle flash, no identifiable threat. Radio chatter likely filled with fragments. Feigned unbekannt, enemy unknown. For the Soviet crew, the sound of the second detonation meant survival. They stayed low, watching the wreckage burn. The corporal did not move immediately. He studied the compass again, the tiny needle still steady on its bearing. It had done its work. Only after 10 minutes did they crawl from cover. The loader, trembling, muttered that he had never seen tanks die like that, at range, without visual. The corporal said nothing. He only touched the compass once, slipped it into his coat, and began recovering the gun with snow. In the distance, the 2 Panzers burned like black candles in a white sea. A German recovery team would later find them side by side, their turrets sheared open. The report, logged days later, listed the cause as anti-tank ambush from concealed position, probable multiple guns. There was no mention of one compass or one gun. But among the Soviet men who witnessed it, the story spread quickly. It became a legend of practicality, proof that even the smallest tools, when guided by patience and geometry, could destroy a symbol of invincibility. What happened that day was not just an ambush. It was the moment when intellect triumphed over intimidation, when one soldier's belief in his method turned ridicule into revelation. And in the cold aftermath, as the smoke drifted eastward over frozen fields, something deeper began to move through the Red Army's ranks. A realization that accuracy, not merely volume, could win battles. That realization would grow, evolve, and soon reach its full test in one of the largest armored engagements in human history. For a single morning, the world around Ostrogajsk went still. By afternoon, reports of 2 tanks destroyed by single gun began moving through the regimental lines, slow at first, then with the speed of rumor. Each man who heard it reshaped the story slightly. Some said the gunner had used a compass. Others swore it was a church spire used as reference. A few insisted he could hear bearings by echo, but at the center of every version lay one unshakable truth. Someone had done the impossible, calculated death with mathematics instead of luck. The unit commander, a weary lieutenant named Kovalchuk, had initially dismissed the corporal's method. But now he watched with interest as other gun crews began marking their sectors with sticks, stones, even broken rifle parts, crude but functional bearing indicators. Within days, several platoons were sighting in advance, not waiting for targets to appear. It was a small shift in behavior, yet tactically profound. The Soviet anti-tank arm had long struggled with reaction time. Guns were often spotted before they fired, crushed under tank treads before they could reload. But now, men were firing first, guided not by instinct but pre-laid geometry. That was new. That was deadly. In divisional headquarters at WWII, a report crossed a desk under the heading, "Enemy armor neutralized by pre-sighted bearings, minimal ammunition expenditure." The language was bureaucratic, dry, but the implications were extraordinary. Someone in command scribbled a note in the margin. "Investigate method, compass use." Within weeks, forward observers were issued simple field compasses and training pamphlets on directional plotting under concealment. Most officers saw it as common sense. Few realized its origin lay in a nameless corporal's improvisation during a blizzard. Meanwhile, on the German side, intelligence units also noticed the pattern. Reconnaissance reports from Panzergruppe Kempf described highly accurate pre-sighted Soviet guns whose fire commenced without spotting exposure. The tone was alarmed. At staff briefings, officers speculated that the Soviets had developed some new optical device or listening instrument. They could not conceive that the key lay in something every child once carried to school, a compass and a map. The result was psychological erosion. Tank commanders began second-guessing their routes. Halting before every open field, delay became standard, caution replaced momentum. The Wehrmacht's iron rhythm, advance, fix, destroy, began to stutter. Back on the Soviet front, the corporal's crew continued their grim work. Their gun had been repositioned twice, each time marked by small scratches on a frozen map case. New bearings, new ranges. Each engagement built confidence. Each successful shot reinforced a belief that intellect could equal armor. But the war's great machinery was moving, and soon, their small method would be absorbed into something vast. In March 1943, Stavka, the Soviet High Command, began preparing defensive plans for the Kursk salient. The landscape was ideal for tanks: rolling steppe, open terrain, clear lines of sight. German planners under Field Marshal Manstein were already envisioning Operation Citadel, a massive pincer strike to cut off Soviet forces. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. And this time, they decided not to meet the Panzers head-on. Instead, engineers, artillerymen, and anti-tank crews dug in for months, creating defense zones layered like armor themselves. Each gun position was plotted not by guesswork, but by bearing and range, pre-sighted on the exact coordinates enemy tanks would have to cross. Thousands of small compass needles spun across the steppe that spring. By July, when the first Tiger and Panther tanks rolled into the northern and southern sectors of the salient, those bearings came alive. Soviet gunners, waiting unseen, fired without adjusting, without exposing themselves. The effect was catastrophic. German formations were torn apart in the first hours of battle by guns that seemed to know their path in advance. The new precision wasn't born from centralized doctrine or advanced optics. It had grown organically, seeded by the logic of survival, nourished by the same ingenuity that had saved a small gun crew months earlier. In that sense, the corporal's compass was more than a tool. It was a symbol of the Red Army's transformation. No longer the blunt instrument of 1941, it had evolved into a force that learned, adapted, and fought with calculation. The psychological tables had turned. The Germans still had superior machines, But the Soviets now possessed something rarer, the confidence to outthink them. Somewhere buried under the snow of Belgorod or Kursk, that corporal's compass likely still rests, rusted, forgotten, meaningless to anyone who might find it. Yet in the invisible arc it once traced, one can see the future shape of Soviet warfare, deliberate, intelligent, unyielding. The moment of the ambush near Ostrogozhsk was over in seconds. But its echo reached every front, where men learned that thinking was as powerful as shooting. And from that echo rose a new kind of battlefield. When the snow finally thawed in late March 1943, the front around Ostrogozhsk was littered with twisted wrecks, blackened steel, half buried in mud. For the Red Army, each destroyed Panzer was more than scrap metal. It was proof that the enemy could bleed, that the myth of invulnerability had limits. But paperwork told the story differently. In the divisional logbook, the destruction of the two tanks was summarized in a single line. Engagement successful, 2 enemy vehicles destroyed. Ammunition expenditure, 3 rounds. No names, no mention of a compass, no note of the method that had made it possible. That was how most revolutions in warfare began, quietly, in margins. The corporal and his team were rotated out for rest shortly afterward. Their gun, scarred by recoil and frost, was reassigned to another crew. For days, they moved through villages reduced to skeletons of timber, passing columns of prisoners and burned wagons. They were anonymous again, part of the faceless tide of the Eastern Front. And yet, something had shifted in the atmosphere of their unit. Men who once fired by instinct now talked about angles and bearings. They scouted positions with more care, not for cover alone, but for lines of fire invisible to the enemy. A kind of quiet professionalism began to replace fatalism. That subtle mental turn, from survival to calculation, was one of the Red Army's greatest hidden evolutions in 1943. It transformed desperation into doctrine. By early April, Soviet training circulars emphasized advanced fire control and sector pre-sighting. Instructors taught recruits how to use landmarks, shadow direction, and even magnetic compasses to prepare ambushes without direct observation. Few knew it had begun as a soldier's toy idea. But ideas in war rarely carry signatures. On the German side, analysts within the 4th Panzer Army compiled loss reports describing unexpected precision fire and engagements from unobservable positions. Countermeasures were recommended: wider flanking reconnaissance, longer-range artillery suppression, and heavier emphasis on forward scouts. Yet none of these addressed the psychological damage already done. Tank crews began speaking of the silent guns, positions that seemed to see them before they could respond. The phenomenon wasn't confined to one front. It appeared from Kharkov to Orel. The myth of German technical superiority had met its first consistent challenger, the methodical intellect of the enemy. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, military journals cautiously noted a renewed tactical efficiency in field artillery and anti-tank defenses. One colonel, writing anonymously in Vonya Missile, Military Thought, described it this way: discipline is no longer only obedience to orders, but mastery of one's tools, intellectual discipline as well as moral. He might never have known the name of the soldier who inspired that sentence. But history doesn't always remember through names. Sometimes it remembers through methods. As the spring mud hardened into summer dust, preparations for the coming German offensive intensified. And though no one could have predicted it yet, the logic of that one compass, that small defiance of ridicule, would soon define the greatest defensive battle of the Second World War. By June 1943, the lessons of Ostrogozhsk had spread like frost over the steppe. Simple concepts, pre-sighted bearings, concealed guns, rapid response, became integrated into Red Army defensive planning. The upcoming German offensive at the Kursk salient would be the first major test of this quiet evolution. At the divisional and corps level, officers began treating pre-calculated anti-tank sectors as routine. Maps were overlaid with numbered bearings, range estimates, and landmark annotations. Field compasses were distributed not as novelty, but as essential equipment. Entire platoons trained to operate without line of sight, firing first on the basis of geometry rather than observation. The impact was immediate. On July 5, when German Panzer divisions advanced into northern Kursk, they encountered resistance unlike anything seen in 1941 or 1942. Soviet guns fired precisely, at distance, from positions concealed among woods, hedgerows, and trenches. Tanks were disabled before they could respond. Dozens of armored vehicles were knocked out in the first hours, often by lighter anti-tank guns operating under strict compass-guided bearings. The method was simple, yet its efficiency rivaled that of much heavier artillery. It demonstrated that training, calculation, and local initiative could overcome superior equipment. Psychologically, the effect on German crews was profound. Veterans of multiple campaigns reported an eerie sensation, artillery and anti-tank fire arriving without warning. Confidence in maneuvering diminished. Field reports frequently mentioned unexpectedly effective Soviet positions or fire from invisible guns, reflecting both tactical surprise and a creeping paranoia. For the Red Army, morale soared. Ordinary soldiers, once accustomed to surviving by chance, now felt empowered by knowledge and preparation. The corporal's compass, once mocked, had become a symbol of intellectual agency. Soldiers began improvising, refining, and sharing new methods across the front. The organizational ripple continued. Stavka formally codified pre-sighted sectors and directional plotting in training manuals. Units practiced creating overlapping zones of fire, using terrain and compass bearings to maximize coverage. The seed sown by one soldier's ingenuity matured into a defensive doctrine that would define Soviet anti-tank strategy for the remainder of the war. Meanwhile, German intelligence struggled to adapt. They deployed additional reconnaissance, aerial observation, and long-range artillery fire, yet these measures often failed to detect hidden Soviet guns. Operational momentum faltered. A tactic designed to be small-scale, a single compass aligning a single gun, had, by replication and adoption, altered the dynamics of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Historians today view these incremental innovations as pivotal. They were not decisive in isolation, but they cumulatively undermined German confidence, slowed armored advances, and showcased the growing sophistication of the Red Army. In a war dominated by tanks, planes, and industrial output, the discipline of thought and ingenuity in the field proved as lethal as any weapons system. By the time the smoke cleared over Kursk, one truth had crystallized. Victories are often measured not only in numbers destroyed, but in ideas implemented. And in that sense, the corporal's toy compass had helped shape the course of history. The field had not changed, but the minds on it had. From frozen snowdrifts near Ostrogozhsk to the vast steppes of Kursk, the principle endured. Calculation, preparation, and ingenuity could bend the rules of war. The stage was set. The war would continue, vast and brutal, but now, small acts of intellect had proven their place alongside the roar of engines and the thunder of shells. In war, as in life, the smallest tools often carry the greatest weight. A compass no larger than a pocket watch, once dismissed as a toy, reshaped a moment and rippled outward across a continent of conflict. It reminds us that in the machinery of war, human thought, patient, precise, and adaptive, can rival even the most fearsome technology. The corporal at Ostrogozhsk did not sit in command rooms. He did not consult maps drafted by generals or fire tanks rolling off assembly lines. He had only his senses, his knowledge, and a compass salvaged from a child's plaything. Yet in that brief, frozen ambush, he demonstrated a fundamental truth. Survival depends not only on courage, but on intelligence, anticipation, and adaptability. That tiny act of ingenuity reflects a broader pattern in history. Great battles are often remembered for generals and machines, but countless small decisions, a line marked in snow, a bearing noted on a map, a needle oriented toward true north, quietly shape outcomes. They alter morale, they teach armies new ways to fight, and they shift the balance of confidence long before the clash of titanic forces. The story also reminds us of war's duality. Machines, strategy, and firepower dominate the headlines, but the human element, creativity, stubbornness, and clarity under pressure can redefine the battlefield. One soldier's ability to see a problem differently, to think in angles rather than impulse, becomes a lesson echoed in manuals, training grounds, and ultimately in history itself. In that frozen ditch near Ostrogozhsk, the ordinary became extraordinary. A toy compass turned into a tool of precision, a symbol of intellectual agency amid chaos. Its impact on morale, doctrine, and the psychology of battle endured far beyond the explosion of two Panzers. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. History is written not only by armies and generals, but by the minds capable of seeing possibility where others see only snow and steel. In war, ingenuity can be as lethal as firepower, and sometimes the smallest needle can point the way to victory.